This is the story of how a specific pivot in Canadian data sovereignty forced a global software giant to re-engineer its entire cloud architecture. In early 2024, a series of legislative updates and judicial interpretations within the Canadian legal system signaled the end of the borderless data era for multinational corporations. At the center of this transformation is OpenText, a Waterloo-based titan that manages billions of files and petabytes of corporate information for the world's largest organizations. As the Canadian federal government moved to modernize the Digital Charter Implementation Act, also known as Bill C-27, the company faced a critical choice. They could either continue with a centralized global hosting model or pivot toward a localized sovereign data strategy. The decision they made has since become a blueprint for how the technology sector must adapt to a world where data is increasingly viewed as a national resource rather than a global commodity. The mechanical force behind this shift was not a single courtroom drama, but a steady tightening of compliance requirements that reached a breaking point in late 2024. For decades, the tech industry operated under the assumption that data was essentially nomadic, flowing to wherever processing power was cheapest and most efficient. However, the introduction of the Consumer Privacy Protection Act and the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act within the C-27 framework changed the economic stakes. These laws introduced some of the steepest financial penalties in the G7, with fines for non-compliance reaching up to 5% of a company's global revenue. For a company like OpenText, which serves nearly all of the Fortune 100, the risk of a single jurisdictional error became a multi-billion-dollar liability. This regulatory pressure was compounded by the fact that Canadian provinces like Quebec had already moved ahead with their own strict residency requirements under Law 25, creating a patchwork of legal hurdles for any company lacking a sophisticated, localized strategy. To understand the scale of this reaction, one must look at the specific technical adjustments OpenText implemented throughout 2024 and 2025. The company's flagship Titanium X initiative was effectively repurposed to address the growing demand for sovereign AI. This was not just a branding exercise, it was a fundamental shift in how servers are partitioned and how encryption keys are managed. In July 2025, OpenText announced a landmark partnership with TELUS to launch the Canadian Sovereign Cloud. This infrastructure ensures that every application, computation, and network operation remains physically within Canadian borders, specifically within facilities in Rimouski, Quebec, and Kamloops, British Columbia. By doing so, they neutralize the reach of foreign legal instruments like the U.S. Cloud Act, which allows American authorities to compel the production of data held by U.S.-linked companies, even if that data sits on foreign soil. By establishing a purely domestic chain of custody, OpenText created a legal airlock that protects sensitive corporate information from extra-jurisdictional reach. This pivot has sent shockwaves through the global market, as other nations observe how a middle power like Canada can successfully mandate domestic control over its digital assets. By late 2025, OpenText cloud services and subscriptions revenue showed consistent growth despite a broader divestiture of legacy assets, indicating that the market is no longer prioritizing raw performance over legal security. We are seeing a global domino effect where countries from the European Union to the Asia-Pacific region are citing the Canadian model as evidence that data sovereignty is both technologically feasible and economically viable. For multinational corporations, the OpenText case proves that the cost of building localized infrastructure is now lower than the cost of the legal risks associated with globalized data. The strategic focus has moved from content in context to AI in context, where the value of an AI model is directly tied to the legal integrity of the data it processes. The real-world implications of this change are most visible in the banking, healthcare, and government sectors. These are industries where the sensitivity of information makes traditional public cloud models a liability. By adopting a sovereign configuration, these organizations can finally leverage advanced AI tools without fearing that their proprietary data will be swept up in a foreign warrant or a cross-border legal dispute. This represents a quiet change because it happened in server rooms and legislative committees rather than in public protests, yet its impact on the stability of global markets is profound. It has forced a reassessment of what cloud computing actually means. It is no longer an ethereal, borderless space, but a collection of strictly regulated national zones. As we look toward 2026, the trajectory is clear. The The Government of Canada has indicated that its full national AI strategy will prioritize data sovereignty, likely embedding these residency requirements into the very fabric of federal procurement. OpenText's proactive shift has allowed them to capture this market early, turning a regulatory hurdle into a competitive moat. They have demonstrated that in the era of artificial intelligence, the most valuable feature a software provider can offer is not just speed or scale, but the certainty of a physical address. The internet is being redrawn, and the lines are being dictated by the laws of the land rather than the logic of the network. This evolution marks the beginning of a more mature, albeit more fragmented, digital world, where the power of information is finally being balanced against the rights of the nations and individuals that produce it. The transition to this new reality was punctuated by the release of OpenText's Cloud Editions 25.4 in October 2025, which specifically targeted the convergence of governed data and autonomous AI agents. By integrating metadata tags for data lineage and retention policies directly into the sovereign cloud layer, the company ensured that information remains auditable. This is critical because as the global regulatory environment hardens, the ability to prove exactly where a piece of data originated and who has accessed it becomes the ultimate currency. Organizations are no longer satisfied with the black box approach of the past. They require a transparent, localized trail that survives the scrutiny of both domestic and international regulators. This movement has also redefined the relationship between technology providers and national infrastructure. The partnership between OpenText and TELUS is a prime example of sovereign AI factory development, where the physical ownership of the land, the data centers, and the silicon chips themselves becomes a matter of national security. When a Canadian company uses Canadian-run infrastructure to process Canadian data, they are essentially opting out of the volatile global digital commons. This provides a level of resilience that is increasingly attractive in an era of heightened geopolitical tension. If a trade war or a diplomatic rift occurs, the digital operations of a sovereign-compliant company remain insulated from the fallout. Ultimately, the shift in OpenText's strategy is a reflection of a broader global reassessment of the value of information. Data is no longer just the new oil, it is the new territory. Just as nations once fought over physical borders, they are now asserting control over the digital borders of their citizens' data. Canada's regulatory pivot was the catalyst that forced OpenText to acknowledge this reality before its competitors did. By the time other global firms began to realize the era of borderless data was ending, OpenText had already built the walls and the gates. This story is not just about a software company changing its business model, it is about the world finally coming to terms with the fact that the digital world must respect physical boundaries. The momentum generated by this shift suggests that we are moving toward a federated internet. In this future, global services will continue to exist, but they will be delivered through a series of locally governed hubs. OpenText's roadmap confirms that they are betting their entire future on this decentralized vision. For the viewer, the takeaway is that the quiet change in Canada's ruling was actually a loud signal for the future of global tech. It represents a move away from the Wild West expansionism of the early internet toward a structured, high accountability system. As more companies follow this path, the very nature of how we interact with technology will change, shifting the focus from global connectivity to local trust. This development serves as a warning and a guide for any entity operating in the digital space. The era of ignoring the physical location of your servers is over. The more serious than expected consequences of Canada's legislative updates have proven that regulators now have the teeth and the technological understanding to enforce their will on the global stage. OpenText's pivot was a survival mechanism that turned into a leadership strategy. By embracing the fragmentation of the digital world, they have secured their place in a future where data residency is the primary requirement for doing business. The shift is complete, and the new digital map of the world has been drawn. Behind these architectural shifts lies a fundamental realignment of corporate priorities. Historically, a chief information officer was judged by the uptime and efficiency of their systems. Today, that metric is being overshadowed by compliance durability. The 2024 Canadian Data Strategy for the Federal Public Service explicitly identified data as a strategic asset, moving the responsibility for its stewardship directly into the hands of executive leadership. OpenText responded to this by appointing its first chief data officer and establishing a data stewardship model that mirrors the federal government's own framework. This alignment ensures that when a government agency or a major Canadian bank looks for a technology partner, OpenText is not just a vendor, but a mirror image of their own internal compliance standards. This level of institutional mimicry is becoming a necessity in the sovereign cloud era. The technological complexity required to maintain this level of sovereignty is immense. It involves not just local storage, but local data clean rooms where AI models can be trained on sensitive information without that information ever leaving the secure environment. OpenText's implementation of Aviator AI capabilities within the TELUS sovereign cloud allows for this kind of isolated processing. A Canadian healthcare provider can now use generative AI to analyze patient records to find trends in chronic illness, knowing that every byte of that data is processed on a server in Rimouski or Kamloops, governed exclusively by Canadian privacy law. This removes the cloud anxiety that has previously held back the digital transformation of the public sector. As we examine the global landscape, the Canadian model is being watched closely by the European Union and the United Kingdom. Both regions are currently debating the extent to which they should mandate domestic control over AI infrastructure. OpenText, having already navigated the Canadian transition, is now using this experience to expand its private cloud offerings in Germany, France, and Australia. By marketing themselves as a sovereign-first provider, they are effectively bypassing the controversy surrounding large US-based cloud giants. This strategy allows them to operate as a local partner in every market, offering a global scale of service with a domestic level of protection. It is a dual identity strategy that represents the future of multinational technology firms. The economic implications are equally significant. Canada's budget 2024 earmarked roughly $2 billion for the sovereign AI compute strategy, specifically to build domestic capacity. OpenText's collaboration with local telecommunications leaders ensures they are positioned to receive a portion of this investment while helping the government achieve its goal of digital autonomy. This public-private synergy is creating a self-reinforcing cycle where the government mandates sovereignty and the private sector builds the tools to achieve it. This cycle is effectively de-risking the Canadian tech economy, ensuring that critical services remain operational even in the face of international digital disruptions. In the final analysis, the story of OpenText and the Canadian regulatory shift is about the maturation of the digital age. The early years of the internet were defined by a lack of boundaries, but the next decade will be defined by their re-establishment. This is not a step backward into isolationism, but a step forward into accountability. When data has a home, it has a protector. When that protector is a sovereign nation with clear laws and strict enforcement, the entire digital ecosystem becomes more stable. OpenText's quiet change in strategy was the first major acknowledgement of this new reality by a global player. It is a transformation that will eventually touch every person who uses a smartphone, every company that stores a file, and every government that protects its citizens. The borders are back, and in the world of high-stakes information management, that is a very good thing.